Thank you very much for joining us, and welcome to everyone that's tuning in to our first ever 𝒖𝒂 Action EUDS Human Rights Week. How are you doing this morning to begin with?
Just wait a second. I have some technical difficulties.
Sure.
Okay, my God. Wait. Okay, finally. Sorry.
No problem.
Oh, thank God. Thank God.
We're
Oh my God. So, how are you?
I'm doing very
Glad
well.
to be here.
Yeah, great. I'm doing well. Thanks for joining us as well. I really appreciate it. Before perhaps we start our conversation, maybe it would be quite useful to introduce our program and introduce yourself to those watching. So as I've said to everyone, welcome to our first ever 𝒖𝒂 Action session. My name is 𝒿𝒊𝒈𝒉𝒕𝒔. I'm the policy officer of VUGS, and I'm delighted to be joined by Vicente today, who is a Romani human rights activist. The 𝒖𝒂 Action Week programme will include 5 sessions on different human rights issues over the course of the next 5 days, from Roma rights to LGBTQI rights, anti-Black racism, refugee rights, and a final workshop on inclusivity and radical empathy. So, Vicente, we're delighted to be joined by Vicente today. Who is a Romani human rights activist. He's the co-founder of TernYpe, the International Roma Youth Network, as well as being the founder of RomaPop, which is an international effort on advocacy for pop culture rights for Romani people. And I'd just like to say, before we do begin, I'd like to encourage everyone watching to really just get as involved as much as possible. So feel free to post your questions in the comment section. And towards the end of this discussion, we'll hopefully get a chance to put them towards Vicente. And for those of you wanting to post about this on social media, use the hashtag TOIA2020, so TOIA, 𝒖𝒂 Action 2020. So thank you, Vicente. To begin with, perhaps could you introduce yourself and your story almost? How did you become to be a human rights activist?
Okay, how did I become a human rights activist? I came originally from Spain. My family is a family of 𝒊𝒈 people, 𝒊𝒈 Romani people that live in the Iberian Peninsula and the south of France. And I came actually from a very humble background. My parents, both of them, were illiterate and quit school very early in life. But as a child, even not having the same opportunities that other children, I was very interested in pop culture and science fiction. And it happens that once when my mother was selling stuff in the street just for us to survive, we stopped in a kiosk and I saw a Marvel comic. And she actually used her daily wage to buy me the comic. And that actually changed my life because I started to be interested in the world that was beyond my own world. And the world of comics and pop cultures, in a sense, provide me with incredible opportunities. So that's a bit of short origin story. Later in life, I didn't study. I quit school when I was 12 years old, but I went a lot to the library, and I love still, and I love at the time rock music. So I started to rent CDs from the Doors and Queen and Led Zeppelin, and to study the lyrics and to learn English by myself. And I had a more or less traditional Roma life till I was about 22 years old. When I was by accident invited to an international Roma youth meeting that was organized by TernYpe then in the very early days. And I got engaged in youth activism and education. And from one thing, I started to jump to another. And this has been 10 years, more or less.
Amazing. And perhaps if we could go back to the story where you say you were outside a kiosk and asked your mum to buy you this comic book. Was this something you were interested in beforehand? Were you aware of comics, and did this play on pre-existing interests, or how did this come about?
In my family background, and I think in most of traditional Roma families, whatever the place, comics are not really a thing. I think even for non-Romani children today, comics are not a thing. Remember for a second that this was 20-something years ago. So we didn't have all the Marvel movies. There was no this science fiction at the time. You know, there was westerns, romance, whatever thing in cinema. It was the time of Kevin Costner, Mel Gibson, and the Spielberg years. You know, the most fantastic thing was Jurassic Park, and that's all. But there were no superhero movies except for Superman or Batman. Superman with George Reeves, and Batman with Michael Keaton. But Marvel was really failing, was in bankruptcy, so Marvel comics were not popular at all. So my family didn't know it, I didn't know it, I was not familiar with it. But from a very early childhood, I was very, very interested in pop culture and trying to understand the world that is outside my world. As a Romani child, when you grow up, you don't realize you're Romani. You just think that everybody is Romani. So we would use the word payo in Spanish to refer to non-Romani people. And as a child, you think that just everybody use the same word, marry in the same way, speak the same language, do the same stuff. And it was through TV that I started to see, okay, this is a really different world. And it was really by luck and by accident, and thanks to my mom, that I got to know the world of comics. And then I was fascinated by the images, the stories, the narratives. And then, of course, when I found out that there were plenty of Romani characters in the world of comic books, this really empowered me and gave me the capacity, for example, to know about the Roma genocide during World War II. That comic books, American comic books, recognized 20, 30 years before than European governments recognize. So in this sense, I had an advantage because I could have a glimpse to a world that was very, very different.
No, that's certainly very interesting, and I'm sure the perception of young people have where they assume that their own environment is just everyone's environment almost, and if you know nothing different, then everyone will be brought up in a similar way is quite a relatable thing, I would think. And if we can go into your work as founder of RomaPop, as you've said in previous interviews, a major focus of this work is advocacy for pop culture rights for Romani people. What exactly is it sort of you mean by pop culture rights? And if you could tell us a bit about your experience with comic books and the power of graphic art from this point that you've spoken about.
Okay, so as I was telling before, comics were a huge inspiration for me. And in my 20s, when I started to participate in seminars and meetings and this kind of stuff, Roma Youth Activism, I started to share about comics. But there was no interest at the beginning. I remember when I was talking in my first Roma seminar about Magneto, the X-Men character that now is Jewish, but for some time he was Roma, or Dr. Doom, who is Roma, or Scarlet Witch, Quicksilver, whatever. And I remember the people looking at me like absolutely crazy. Like there is no interest in these comics. In Roma, don't read comics. People don't know who is Magneto. It's a very, like mambo jumbo, strange stuff. People is not gonna get it. But I insisted and I repeated like the gospel. So wherever seminar I went, I would use the coffee pause, I would use the cigarette pause for the one who smoke. I don't smoke, but I will jump there and I will tell everybody, you know about comics, you know about Magneto, you know about X-Men, almost as a preacher. And over the time, this really took the strength. So I started to screen the X-Men movies and I started to screen cartoons and use comic books with educational means. For example, I have here with me, this over here is the first mention to Romani people in Marvel Comics. This is 1962, 1963, and it's the Roma origin of Dr. Doom. So, for example, I would take the comic and I will go to the pages and I will share with them, and then we will try to analyze the narrative. And for some people, and for some time, to use comic books and comic movies is a great empowerment because in the Roma world, in the world of Roma activism, people talk about, look, a Roma lawyer, a Roma doctor, a Roma whatever, Roma in university, Roma in the parliament. And these are fantastic things, but we need something else. People need something else. People need hope. People need dreams. People need to be able to challenge a narrative that is not just external. It's not enough to have Roma who are doctors or lawyers. You gotta have your own superheroes. You gotta be able to open a comic book or watch cartoons in the morning or go to cinema and to see, this is my people. This is, for example, what happens to African Americans with the Black Panther movie. That was a boom. And in the last 20 years, minorities has been fighting for better representation in the world of pop culture. Now, my work was not this. My work was educational. So I talk about comic resources and movies and this kind of stuff, and I talk about political narratives. So, for example, when I talk about X-Men, I will say, are you for inclusion or are you for revolution? And a lot of times, people that could not relate to these topics in the typical boring seminars, because these are complex issues, they will be very engaged. But at a point, I realized that to educate is not enough. I gotta be able to change what's it in comics. People gotta write more respectfully. They gotta write with some sense, because at the same time that Marvel Comics gave us all these incredible Romani characters, they also include some horrible stereotypes. So then in 2014, I decided to go to the United States with the help of a fantastic grant. And the first year was I realized, America is also a totally different world, and also nobody knows who are Roma, and nobody cares. And comic book writers couldn't care less. Now, the original comic book writers, people like Stan Lee or Jack Kirby or Steve Ditko, they did care about the fate of minorities in Europe, and they did know about the Romani struggle. A lot of them, if not most of them, were Jewish themselves, and there was a connection. But when American comics were took over by corporations, the treatment of Romani people actually changed, and it became worse. So in the 90s and early 2000s, Romani people were treated more poorly in American comics than in the 60s or in the 70s. So for the second year, I decided to travel to America with a group of friends in an absolutely insane plan. So it was with us, we have Patricia Caro, an Spanish Romani feminist, Michael Simmons, an African-American activist, 72 years old at the time, who met Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, Dafina Savic, a Canadian Serbian Romani activist, my brother, because why not? Because I was broke, I didn't have a sense, so why not include my brother anyway? There was also, as the Jewish ambassador in the Comic-Con event, it was my good friend Benny Fisher that had the position of president of UGS at the time. So together with the team, we went to the New York Comic Con, and then it was all madness. We started to fight with the Marvel authors, talk with them, go into the question time, to organize some kind of boycott, and partially we succeed. Because if you read the comics, how they talk about Romani people from that moment on till now, it's a huge success. But of course, at the same time, we needed more resources, more people, more allies, and it's also it's a hard thing to spend your life reading comics, and then to go and to meet the writers of the comics I was reading these comics when I was living like in a favela, and these comics were uplifting me. And to go to a place like Comic-Con and to find out that the writer that wrote these fantastic stories is a super racist, hateful guy. It's a heartbreaking thing, to try to separate the world of your dreams and to understand there is an industry that can perpetuate or fight against stereotypes. So yeah, we did this in the Comic-Con, and then for some years we tried to be as much active as we could. And now we're planning, or I'm planning, trying to settle in Berlin. I'm living now in Berlin. And to be able to open RomaPop as a Verein, as an association in Berlin, to try to do something locally, because there is also a strong need to do something in a field that is not explored, which is Romani pop culture, the promotion and the creation of Romani pop culture.
That's so interesting, and yeah, I like how it's your passion, and it's gone for quite a niche topic as well, I guess. I'd be quite interested to know what your assessment is of portrayals of Romani people at the moment in pop culture in general.
In general, in pop culture, it's terrible. I mean, the taking account also that from 2014, from 2010 till now, there has been a backlash, so to say. So during the Obama administration, pop culture, there was a slogan in Marvel Comics, to put a short example, that was all new, all different. So then suddenly Thor was a woman, Captain America was black, first gay wedding in a comic book. So this went up. But then from 2016 till now, it went down. So everybody is again white and women are again invisible, and it's a very tricky thing, and you don't know how to distinguish which part of diversity in pop culture is born from a genuine interest and which part is born because of a market strategy. And the problem with Romani people, why we have such a poor representation, is that we simply do not have any element of negotiation. We cannot negotiate. We don't have ambassadors. We don't have political representatives. We have two. We have one. I mean, we don't have an effective lobby in civil society. We have less than 0.001% of people in universities, like, or even with basic education. So to try to build, I mean, that's what was insane of RomaPop, to take such a precarious representation and try to challenge it with 7 persons at the time. So that it was truly a miracle that we, in a sense, succeed. Today, the portrait of Romani characters, for example, in the movies, every Romani character in Marvel Comics has been transformed into non-Romani, every single character. And in a lot of the comics, yes, they talk about the Romani identity, and they talk positive about Romani identity, I think, because they're afraid of the backlash. But there is no a single Romani author in Marvel Comics or in DC Comics, and there is no Romani guidelines on how to write Romani characters. Like, what we try to do, just is very simple to understand. Imagine somebody would be writing about 15, 20 Jewish characters. Would you like to have a certain degree of knowledge of what they're writing about Jewish characters, like not to be presented in a negative light constantly? It's reasonable. And minorities have this, like Asian, Pacific Americans got this, Jewish people got this, in a sense, despite the fact that Jewish people is really invisible in the world of comic books, in the sense that many of the characters who were historically Jewish have also been, I don't know how to say, whitewash, or the Jewish size for the movies. For example, Kitty Pryde in X-Men, which is Jewish in the comics, is not represented as Jewish in the movies. Or the Thing for Fantastic Four, that is Jewish in the comics, is not represented as Jewish in the Fantastic Four movies, etc., etc. But yeah, this is the ongoing battle, trying to get a better representation. But it's quite difficult now, especially with the situation in the US. There is so much tension. Got no idea.
No, certainly. That's very, very interesting. Thanks for sharing that with us. On this topic of representation and sort of broader than in the comic book world and in all areas of society, we often talk about, as you've said as well, the need to see more positive representation. When we talk about a Jewish identity, for instance, it's often done in the realm of anti-Semitism and the Holocaust and in the realm of suffering. But it's very important to stress that there is a positive Jewish identity, as I'm sure in the same way in other minorities and in Romani communities as well. How important was it for you to see Roma identities represented in pop culture? And how do you think we can work towards boosting Romani representation in all areas of society?
That's a great question. So coming back to my personal story again, in 2013-14, with a friend of mine, 𝑹𝒊𝒈𝒉𝒕𝒔, that was actually part of the RomaPop initiative when we were in New York. We traveled all over Europe meeting Romani people. We make tons of interviews, we listen tons of testimonies, and we saw a lot of children. And every single time I was seeing Romani children in the outskirts of society, living in garbage dumps. To be honest, I mean, there are some places in Europe that are worse than any place you see in any documentary about, I don't know, the poorest place in India or wherever our colonial mentality in poverty there is. And when you see all these young people, particularly children, with no future at all, and not even the hope to be able to see themselves reflected in a positive light in any way, is devastating. And I think that was for me very important, to be able to provide some hope in case anybody access to these pop culture platforms, that there is an alternative, there is another way that you can see yourself. So this is what we try. How to do it, it's an incredibly difficult thing. Today it's very difficult because in the case of Romani people, if you are a Romani activist and you talk about Romani representation, the first answer that you will have is that who care about representation? people don't have light or water. So first you need to fight against people in your own team that is telling, we don't have light, we don't have water, we are massacred, we are suffering a massacre by the police. Like in Spain, for example, which is a good country for Roma. In the last year and a half, there has been 4 Roma assassinations by the police or in racist incidents. So when you talk about Romani representation in comic books, it is logic that a part of civil society itself will tell, well, you're crazy. But particularly for me, I do think that if we change and address pop culture and representation, if we provide this hope, we can really contribute in a very positive way to society, not just because the Romani people see another image of themselves, but also because it's important that non-Romani people in countries like Hungary or Romania or in some Balkan states, it's very important that they are able, non-Romani people, to see a different idea and a different example of Romani people. I put you an example. You know Batman and Robin, of course. And the original Batman, Bruce Wayne, is of Catholic Irish ascendance, origin. But Robin, Richard Grayson, was a Romani person in the comics. So Batman and Robin was Roma. Later on in the comics, Robin became Batman. So Batman was Roma. Imagine for a second, you know, like neo-Nazis and fanatics, they tattoo, they love all these fascist fantasies of power. Everything that is a strong man, shooting people, fighting with people. So they will have a swastika and they will have the Batman symbol. Batman and Superman symbol are 2 of the most well-known symbols, together with the cross and together with the half moon. So the power of pop culture is incredible. And if people would be able to go to cinema, even racist people, and to see, oh, okay, oh, Batman is Roma, or Robin is Roma, or they are there, but they're not doing what I expect them to do, which is the stereotype I have been drinking all my life. This could be potentially revolutionary. I can put you an example of this. Like, for example, when African Americans travel to Europe, very often they are treated good. They are treated better than in the United States. And the reason that they're treated better than in the United States is not just because of money, but it's because in Europeans, we have been watching The Prince of Bel-Air, Listen and Motown, Family Matters, all these 80s, 90s TV shows. So we have this idea of Will Smith and these people, and they're nice, and Martin Luther King and whatever. And then you have Black Panther, and then you have all this. And then you have people in all the political spectrum that go to see a movie like Black Panther without criticizing this, because everybody in the movie is black. So the power that a pop culture product produces in society, it's huge. It's huge. That's why minorities have interest in to be able to have a better representation. Unfortunately, in the case of Romani people, we are in a very, very early stage, and the situation is quite challenging. Yeah.
Absolutely. And, you know, it definitely, this issue of hope that you mentioned couples, I'm sure, with education, which will no doubt, as I've looked into, sort of relate to your work at TernYpe, for instance, which has a focus on education and very much tries to realise this goal of greater Romani representation in many areas of society. Perhaps you could tell us a bit about this initiative particularly, whilst touching upon the role that you see education has in your work, and as you've mentioned, not just formal education, but informal education as well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, the work of RomaPop, in a sense, is very focused on pop culture and representation in pop culture, this kind of stuff. But TernYpe, it was what is supposed the kind of association or network that every community has. You know, you have organizations of youth Armenians, organizations of youth Jewish people, you have organizations of youth anything. But for many, many years in Europe, you have nothing regarding youth and Romani people. So we wanted to knock the typical doors, you know, like to work with the Council of Europe, the European Commission, to know, you know, to get into the world of training, seminars, exchanges, to try to change a person at a time, not just for the empowerment of Romani people, but also a lot of our work, it was to educate non-Romani people. In seminars, and I have many friends at UGS that have witnessed this, and I shared this with them many, many times. You probably will be shocked in a seminar where there is Romani and non-Romani people because people arrive with such an incredible amount of stereotypes that you will need to dedicate 2-3 days just to confirm your own humanity. So for many years, what we actually did, it was to try to change people one at a time, organizing seminars, exchange, and we had this very hippie, progressive European approach of free hacks and flash mobs and all this kind of stuff. What happens is that starting in the last 10 years, in the second decade of the 21st century, far right start to grow. Neo-Nazis start to grow, attacks start to grow, governments became more and more hostile. I mean, we have the pictures in France, we have cases of assassinations, sterilization, aggression to Holocaust survivors, everything you can imagine. So with this situation, we needed to change. And that's why Holocaust education or Roma genocide education became a very important part of our work. That is still very, very challenging. I can put you an example of the kind of challenges that not just TernYpe, but European civil society, European Roma civil society at large is facing. We fought 50 years, 50 years, to get a memorial for the assassination and persecution of Romani people, Roma and Sinti people by the National Socialists. So we fought for 40 years. This fight includes hunger strikes, survivors putting themselves in chains in concentration camps, etc., etc., you can imagine. And after this, when we got a place and we have a deal with the government, a bus company delayed the process 20 years. And when finally, I mean, when there was no survivors, everybody's dead, we finally got the monument in Berlin, the city I'm living now. And less than 8-9 years after the memorial has been standing there in front of the memorial of the assassinated Jews during the Holocaust, or the train company now wants to just move it away a bit. Can you try to imagine that the train company came to the people that are the survivors or the direct descendants of the survivors and says, we're just going to take half of the memorial. It's not really important. We really need it for the train. So we started really as this young hippie, very happy people dancing around. I was young and skinny with a lot of hair and all this kind of stuff. But the world really slapped you in your face, and it became incredibly challenging to be able to adapt to the current circumstances. Yeah. If I talk a lot, please put me down and refocus me, because I can talk about everything.
Not at all. It's very, very interesting. It's a shocking anecdote about wanting to change the site of Roma remembrance. And this is something that we've had some questions and sent in beforehand, so we will come on to that in more detail in a bit, I'm sure. You've spoken about the ascendant far right, which is a huge problem that all minority communities across Europe are facing. And at EUGS is something that we do actively try and work against. Within Europe, hate speech has been used against Romani communities regularly, and it's all too commonplace. Recently in the past month, with neo-Nazi demonstrations taking place in Hungary, for instance. In Slovakia, it's also a very poor situation for Romani communities. And there's even incidents of hate speech being used against Romani people in the European Parliament itself. What work do you do to highlight the dangers of hate speech and anti-Gypsyism more broadly, and to fight against it?
I mean, for example, in 𝒖𝒐𝒐, that is the Roma genocide remembrance event that we organize every year in Poland, where we bring hundreds, thousands of young people to Auschwitz. We have an educative program where we focus in the history of Romani people during World War II, but also the dangers of the far-right movements and neo-Nazism today. So we get young people and we divide them in groups, we create facilitator groups, we have 8 different educational programs, and we try to give them the tools and the knowledge so they are able to challenge the existing narrative, to learn better, to combat better. So we do a lot in the sense of educational work. But then when it comes to the world of policy making, again, policy is based on the idea of negotiation. Nobody gets the rights because you expose it and people say, oh, that's fantastic, we are all human beings. But actually, you got to have something to negotiate. It's about the tools for negotiation. Because we have such a precarious situation, we can do a lot in the world of education, but we can do extremely little in the world of policy. So we got crowdfundings, Facebook chains, MPs who sign letters of support. Sometimes there is some cases that we bring to the Strasbourg Tribunal of the International Tribunal of Human Rights in Strasbourg, and then it stops. And change to happen, if it happens, it's not just rare, but it's so easily revertible. For example, the first case of when Czechoslovakia was divided between Slovakia and Czechia, there was a Roma family who was actually not accepted by either country. And this was one of the first, if not the first case of Romani people that arrived to the Strasbourg Court of Human Rights. It's a flagrant attack against the rights of these people. After 10 years, they were given the yes, you're right. And yes, they were allowed to stay there. But then again, the same thing happened. So they were again homeless and again the same thing. And you cannot spend your whole life going to Strasbourg for every single human rights violations in the scale we are seeing the reality of Romani people with, again, it's a incredible scale. So yes, we can organize breakfast in the European Parliament, in the Mickey Mouse coffee, in the old times. Now with Corona, I think nobody's going nowhere for a coffee. But yes, we can organize breakfast, we can have briefings with the European members of European Parliament, political parties. But the parliament is a very curious place. I put you an example, for example, in the Social Economic Forum, about 3 years ago, I was there and we were witnessing a talk and they were talking, the Commissioner of Justice, they were talking about Roma inclusion. One person there started to say the most abominable things about Romani people. That Romani people play too much football. These are literal declarations. That the far right and the Nazis are actually the friends of Romani people. That the Holocaust was not so bad. That Jews itself didn't suffer so much in World War II. I mean, an absolute barbarity, an absolute disaster, not just for Roma, but for anybody who have any sense of decency or democracy. Not a single person in a room of 300, not a single person, not the moderator, not a single person raised their hand and says, this is wrong. Now people raise their hand, but nobody speaks because, you know, the rules and whatever, blah, blah, blah. So then in that moment, I couldn't resist. I started to scream. You're a fascist, this is fake, you know, this kind of emotional outburst. And then I thought, they're not gonna let me anymore into the European Parliament because, you know, I call these people fascists and whatever. And when I went out, everybody congratulated me. The moderator, the people from all the European groups. Now, thinking this for a second, this is a place where everybody knows what's right and what's wrong, and they may congratulate you after, but during the discussion, when you are listening things that are against everything that the institution represents, most people will keep silence. So policy is a challenge. Policy is a real challenge, yes. We can get letters of support, we can get some funds, very little funds for very little Roma organizations, but we can get something. But when it's about to do something meaningful, for example, the memorial or the 2016 recognition of the Roma genocide during World War II and the persecution of Romani people, when it comes to these things, they're incredibly difficult to achieve and they're incredibly fragile. Yeah, and we are still, as a movement, Romani young people and Romani movement in general, we are a bit lost in the sense that I study a lot theories of change and how things should change. And in the first level of change, you have education. This is mostly what we do. In the second level of change, you have policy making. And this is already a challenge. In policy making, you have demonstrations, you have people in the streets, you have whatever is in there. Then in the third level, if policy making fails, then you have legal litigation. We also did this. The Romani movement, Romani young people, Romani people from the last 40 years tried this. It also failed. And the two last layers of change of a situation are boycott and violence. Of course, we are an extremely peaceful movement. Not just Romani people is extremely peaceful. Like, if you have a look, for example, in Europe, almost every single group in Europe, every single group of people with any claim, whatever it was, nationalist, whatever, everybody have had a terrorist organization. Everybody have had a terrorist organization, or break some glass somewhere, or do something to somebody, or threats. Never with Romani people, because violence is absolutely out of our mental universe. Organized violence, we are able to violence one-to-one, but we're not able of this organized political violence. And I wonder many times, as a very critical, cynical reflection, analyzing the situation in Europe and analyzing the situation of Romani people in the last 1,000 years we're here, if our incapability, our inability to understand the value of violence in the political dimension is what has put us in this terrible condition. Because when you look again, I mean, think for example, somebody put a bomb in a car. Then suddenly the parliament or the policymakers or the municipality or whatever, they're gonna change the political speech to say, we gotta attend this, we gotta stop this, we gotta give funding priority, we gotta have this whatever priority. But then you have then you have 20,000 Romani persons in absolute poverty, who are traveling to the West for a better life, who are beaten down, killed, and evicted in France by governments of both the left and the right. So this is a very cynic, dark, sad reflection, but it's just to point out how incredibly difficult the situation is, and how far can we go with education is a very big question. Maybe this is how change happens. Maybe this is the best we can do. It's definitely what we do, because we don't know how to do nothing. Also, it's not just we are not violent, but like, I mean, just look at me for a second. Do I seem to you somebody threatening? Probably not. So,
no,
yeah, we lack this.
No, thank you very much for sharing. That's a very interesting analysis for sure. I think it's important to say at this point, you mentioned the difficulty that comes from advocacy and policy making. Actually, last month, EUGS, in partnership with 𝑹𝒊𝒈𝒉𝒕𝒔, took part in an hashtag Act for Roma Lives campaign, and sent an open letter to the President of the EU Commission, the European Parliament, and recently received actually a letter back from the Commission about the subsequent steps that they plan on taking. So I'm sure we'll follow up with them, and let's see how this campaign goes forward in that. Perhaps coming back to the topic of remembrance that you mentioned, and as I said, that we have a lot of interest on from those that were planning on watching this. As a European Jewish organisation, among other areas at EUGS, we place a lot of importance on the topic of remembrance, whilst also being sure, like I say, to emphasise and support a vibrant and sustainable Jewish future in Europe. How do you and your work balance the notion of remembrance, as exemplified through 𝒖𝒂𝒏, and apologies for any bad pronunciation, the Roma Genocide Remembrance Day, but with an eye to the future? So how do you balance the need for remembrance whilst staying relevant for young people, I guess?
Well, actually, Holocaust education in general, or education in the Roma genocide during World War II, is one of the most important parts of our work, and one of the most positive efforts that we can commit together, young people, Roma, non-Roma, whatever. And this is also because when we look the field of political action, there is so little we can do today. There is so little we can do today that it actually is a great help if we can go into the past 70, 60 years, and we can bring about examples of the reality people live, to bring also courage. This year, I think about a month ago, Raymond Gourem, a French Manus Roma survivor of the Holocaust and survivor of different concentration camps, died. He was 94, 95, I think. And we invited him to I don't know, 10, 20 meetings. This is a man, he has an extraordinary story. I just want to share a bit about why commemoration is so important for us and remembrance is so important for us. He never took a plane till he was 92 years old. 92, thinking this. He was like 25 kilos, smaller guy in the world. But when he saw what Romania and Roma were suffering in France, or what Roma were suffering in Hungary, he says, I need to speak out about my experience. And he never told to nobody. He was ashamed, he was conflicted, he was afraid. He never talked about the Nazis, what happens when they arrive to France and all this. And then he started to talk. And the thing that I have been told by friends of him, closer friends of him, of course, that the thing that terrified him the most, it was to fly. He never took he was living in a caravan. He never took a flight in his whole life. And then he took one flight to Poland, but then he went to the UK, he went to Scotland. He went, I don't know, like 25 countries, from 0 to 1,000, from not talking during 70 years to serve with everybody, with thousands of young people about his story, calling to resistance. For the Romani young people that participated in the events and that listened his testimony, it was so important to have somebody that have experimented something, such a dark episode in our history, and that was able to bring about hope and the spirit of resistance. For us, it's important to understand about the persecution in the past and the Roma genocide during World War II, because it's important for us to be able to draft power for our modern struggle, because this is the only reference we got. You know, we gotta go back 70 years and we gotta look to our history, and we gotta be able to take these testimonies and take the few survivors that are still remaining and to be able to learn from them. So that was very important for us, and it's something we try to put together, the struggle of today and the struggle of the past. And in the case of Romani people, I don't know if I can say the same about Jewish people, because obviously, I mean, you know better than me. But in the case of Romani people, our struggle is so connected. Think, for example, just think from an historical perspective in Romania, just Romania. Romania and Roma are some of the most visible Roma that people see in Western Europe. They are the box where people put all the stereotypes of Roma. For sure, sometimes you have been in a restaurant like me, and you are just having your restaurant, and there is a dark-skinned woman with broken hands, with a how you call this, whatever, with a scarf in the head, with a small paper glass, asking for money, or selling tissues or whatever thing. So this is one of the most visible faces of Roma exclusion, poverty, and reality. Now, there are 12, 14 million Roma in Europe, but let's go to this country and to these people for a second. These people were enslaved 400 years. They belonged to the Orthodox Church in Romania. They were cattle. They were sold like cattle. We're talking about a very, very similar process of African Americans. But after the slavery, they have 20 years to get a university, get a newspaper, get included in society, and then World War II starts. And in 1933, 1934, all Romani intellectuals are killed. And then communism arrived. And during communism, people is sterilized, people is put in, again, in different camps. And now they're not concentration camps, now they're gulags. And then communism ends, and then capitalism arrives. And then these people have nothing, no tool to participate in society in any possible way. Can't you imagine for a second, slavery, First World War, Second World War, communism, and then today? Like it's, if you go if you try to understand it from an historic point of view, it's devastating. It's devastating because these people, particularly Romania, Roma, they didn't have a break in the whole time they have been in Europe, like in the last 1,000 years, not even a break. There is not even a single time in their history where you could say it was a happy time. Now, as far as I know, in the sense of Jewish people, the pattern is a bit different, because, for example, what happens, what for my little humble knowledge, is that Jewish people arrive to a place, they're persecuted, they adapt, they succeed, and then they're evicted. And they go to other place, they're persecuted, they suffer discrimination, they adapt, they succeed. highly educated people, super smart people, successful people in the middle of the worst possible circumstances, like the people who wrote American comics, like Stan Lee, Jack Kirby, all these people. They were Jewish people who, so Stan Lee, the guy who invented a lot of these comic book characters, his real name was Stanley Lieber. Okay, but in that time, even in this progressive America, to have a Jewish surname was a problem. So most of Jewish people will change their surname to make it sound less Jewish, so to say. So Jacob Kotzburg was Jack Kirby. Stanley Lieber was Stanley. So there you have the struggle, the persecution, people looking twice at them in the street, but then you have their capacity for success. Their struggle against persecution, you know, the spirit rising. This is the beautiful story of Jewish people. In the case of Romani people, you cannot name a decade, 10 years that you could say, well, these 10 years we succeed, we managed to be part of this society or whatever. So yeah.
No,
it's a big struggle. Sorry, I don't know if I went too far from the original question.
not at all. This is very much an open space where I'm just interested to hear your thoughts on the various topics. Before, if I could ask one more question before we go into sort of question and answer. We have two sort of audience questions at the moment, if that's all right, to put to you if you have time. But before we get on to that, in speaking to trying to sort of generate a positive outlook to look to end on, I guess, and speaking to an audience of students and young professionals with a deep interest in human rights issues, how would you encourage them to get involved in standing up for Romani communities in Europe and get involved in advocacy for human rights, those out with Roma communities?
Okay, you're talking about how do we get involved, young non-Romani people or young Romani people, or in general?
In general, I'd be interested for non-Romani people as well, but in general, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, in my understanding, these are very different processes because people come from very different places. So when we talk about how to engage young non-Romani people, we gotta be able to generate in them a question: what about if what I have believed all my life about Romani people is not true? And this is actually, I mean, this can be challenging, but in this sense, coexistence, to have young people, Romani and non-Romani people together, is the best exercise, is the best that we can do, because when people live together is when people is able to see each other humanity. It's the most important. And then, of course, there is education in history and whatever stuff, and education and to understand history is so important. One of the exercises that I did with UGS, but I did also with other minorities when we tried to build alliances, is I had a sheet called 11 Facts About Romani People. And I would go through the history and I would ask people to read the historical events to understand, okay, the situation is bad. Because we can just come to terms to understand each other if we understand the history of each other. Without understanding the history of each other, I mean, if somebody don't know Roman history, he may think, oh, you know, these beggars, these people, or whatever, and in TV I see they sing, live in caravan, whatever stereotypes people have in mind. There is, of course, a lot of people that will tell you exactly the same story. When I was a child, a Romani man stole my bike. I mean, I've listened so much to this story. For example, you know, you have these kind of urban legends, narratives, whatever. For people to get a mix between an education in history and human rights, and to meet Romani people can be a transformative experience for non-Romani people. And a lot of non-Romani people, even the ones that arrive with huge prejudices, are radically affected by the notion of understanding that a lot of the stereotypes they had in their life were fundamentally lies. In the case of how to engage Romani people, sometimes to engage Romani people is more difficult than to engage non-Romani people, because Romani people face such limitations. Which example I can put you? I could put you so much examples. I have a friend here in Berlin. I don't want to say his name. I had a friend here in Berlin, Roma originally from Romania, who lost his father, lost his mother, ended up homeless when he was 6 years old, traveled the whole world, surviving, arrived to Berlin, live in the streets, then start to participate in seminars or in workshops. I mean, the challenge is that somebody like this, it's not that I need to convince him to fight for Romani rights, but if you would go, this when we talk about Romani young people, you have a lot of histories like this. But if you talk about intervention in communities, how incredibly difficult is to convince a community that have no water or light, which people have no shoes, that they need to stand, for example, for democratic education, when from their point of view, they don't even understand democracy because democracy didn't bring them any apparent advantage. So the way to think of a lot of Romani young people and Romani communities is we gotta take care of today. We gotta find out what we're gonna eat today, what we're gonna eat tomorrow. After tomorrow, we don't care. We gotta survive. So to create something with that can be incredibly challenging. But we managed to attract a lot of Romani young people and to empower them, to inspire them. Now, the most difficult thing is that we are still very early in the Romani youth movement. These are very early days. We are strong in a sense. Our heart is strong, but our circumstances are not. The circumstances couldn't be worse in a sense. So we also lack to be able to of a well-established structure where we could put the people to work. And also from other side, most of civil society is based on voluntary work. Most of people is volunteer. I'm a volunteer. Everybody's a volunteer. To convince people that quit school when they are 12, like I did, to become a volunteer, it's uncanny. I mean, so in many times we will organize a seminar with Roma on Roma, and I will not ask people, but I would say that most of the times I would know who is Roma or who is not Roma by talking, by meeting the people fast. And when I would look around, it's so common to have in a Roma on Roma seminar 6 Roma, 20 non-Roma, because it's so, even the non-Roma that has prejudices, it's easier to engage them because they have access to the tools, to society, to democracy, to whatever. And for Romani people, like for example, I can tell you a few years ago, I organized a seminar. I bring a Romani brother and a Romani sister to a seminar in Berlin. 20 persons of the family came to the airport crying. Nobody ever in the whole family took a plane. I mean, to participate in this European civil society, for a lot of people coming from traditional and vulnerable Roma communities, it's an incredible challenge. Like, we have the tools of engaging, we have the narratives, we have the stories, we have the methodology, we have ourselves, people that is committed. What we don't have is a friendlier environment that allows to build a bigger structure that actually functions. And this is really challenging because we cannot simply give food to people. We cannot sustain their interest sometimes.
Absolutely. I honestly, I didn't appreciate at times the difficulty that there might be engaging certain people from within the Romani community, as you said. That is important to keep in mind. Now, if you don't mind, if I can go to a couple of audience questions. We got a flurry of them just through to the email as well there. But going back up, we've got a question from Lior, who is also based in Berlin. And she asks, where do you think the strengths of Romani and Jewish advocacy lie? Have you encountered any specific challenges in this joint effort?
That's a good question. So the question is like, what are the strengths of Romani and Jews working together, or just the strength of Romani and Jewish advocacy efforts by themselves? Separately?
I think it's a joint initiative, absolutely, in sort of building coalitions, I guess.
Well, I think, I mean, definitely from the historical point of view, very often in the United States, there is the narrative about black and white, and everything is divided into black and white. And very often in certain political speeches, Jews are classified as white. Then in Europe, instead of black and white, people talk about people of color. And very often, Romani people will be classified as people of color. But if you look to the history, for 1,000 years at least, Romani people and Jewish people were existing before even the idea of race existed. We do predate as a people the idea of race. Race as an idea, as a concept, didn't exist in the Roman times. It was invented during the colonial times. It was invented in the Americas. It was invented in both South and North America. So our connections in history as a people living in Europe, if you will take Napoleon legislation on Jews and Roma is 1-to-1 point. If you will take when Jews were evicted from one country, Roma were evicted at the same time for the most of the times. For example, when in the same order that evicted Jews of Spain, Roma were evicted too. Just Roma, for some reason, remained, and Jews went to Italy and to Greece, and Sephardic Jews, they went to different parts of the world. But if you analyze the history, we had so much in common. This is a very powerful thing. When you think in the European context, we had so much in common. Of course, we shared the destiny during World War II, different persecution, but we shared the fact that we were persecuted by the Nazis and in whatever country that we were trying to hide. And then when we look into the 21st century, I think the advantages for Romani people to be able to approach and work together with Jewish people is to be able also to see a different kind of story and a different way to approach society. And for example, for the most times, Jewish efforts have been focused on sharing about oneself, being open, educated, and sharing about oneself. In the case of Romani people, the efforts have been totally in the different dimension. We don't participate, we don't share, we keep everything secret. This is how we protect ourselves. So there you see these two peoples in very similar circumstances, imagining society into a very, very different way. And I think this is very, very interesting to be able to see at each other as a reflect of what could be. What could be. I think Jewish and Romani people, we share a lot of our history in Europe, probably the World War II, where things changed. Like the number of Jews before World War II in Europe was, I don't know exactly, but probably was like 7-8 million, something like this. And after World War II, radically, like the Jewish population almost disappeared completely in Europe. It was reduced dramatically.